Today is March 18th, 2013, and we are at the home of Ronald Johnson Horton in Garden City, South Carolina. My name is Marilyn Scanlon, and I am a member of the Theodosia Burr chapter, the Daughters of the American Revolution. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project in the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. My husband, John Scanlon, will be recording our interview today. Mr. Horton was born on March 5th, 1926. Mr. Horton served during World War II and the Korean War. The highest rank Mr. Horton obtained was Staff Sergeant.
Great. I am Ronald Johnson Horton, born in upstate New York, near a little town called Hamilton, and I walked to a one-room schoolhouse for grades 1 through 6, and I bused to Hamilton Central School, grades 7 through 12. I majored in art, and I received the rank of honorary lieutenant in the Navy in their identification of aircraft systems during the war, to teach the recruits identification of aircraft so they wouldn't shoot down their own planes. I was also in the high school band, Boy Scouts, and an avid skier. I entered the U.S. Army at age 18 on June 30th, 1944. I took basic training in artillery in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and following basic training, I attended 5 weeks of radio school. I was assigned to headquarters and headquarters battery of the 942nd Field Artillery Battalion in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. They were preparing to go overseas and told me that stuff was all crated in the yards of the buildings, and I asked them if they were getting in new equipment, and the driver who had picked me up said, "No," he said, "we're going overseas. We've been waiting for you." I guess I was a single replacement. We departed New York City on January 9th and had a very, very rough trip overseas. The Atlantic in January is no place to be if you are seasick prone, which I was. The ship landed in Le Havre, France, January 23rd, 1945, and prior to our landing there was a large explosion, which we didn't know what it was because there were ships all around us, and it turned out that the ship was hit with either a torpedo or a mine and was sunk, and that ship had all of our heavy equipment on it. So it was sunk, and we had nothing to fight with except a carbine. So we had to wait 9 weeks before we received our heavy equipment at Brussels, Belgium. We stayed in a tent city called Camp Lucky Strike, which we had to build before we could call it home. During the 9 weeks waiting, we cleared minefields in areas where the troops landed on D-Day, and this was all during a terrible winter. In fact, it was the worst winter that Northern Europe had had in 50 years. I developed frostbite in my fingers and toes and pneumonia, and the battalion medical officer told the colonel that they had to get me into a heated billet or I wouldn't make it. The colonel commandeered a bedroom with a fireplace in a French chateau. Boy, what comfort. By the time I recovered our equipment, had arrived in Brussels, Belgium, and the colonel ordered the service battery to go and pick up all the equipment, the big tracks that pull the big guns, and he wanted them to mount antennas and machine guns and equipment on this equipment that arrived on the way back to our billet. That way the vehicles would be ready to go to combat as soon as they got back, and we loaded everything up. We finally entered Germany on April 1st, 1945. Most of our time in combat was in support of the 101st Airborne, or the Screaming Eagles. My eeriest night was when a group of us had to set up an OP, which is an observation post, in the cupola of an abandoned steel mill on the edge of the Rhine River. It was about 100 feet up, very dark, and with all the dust and grit, very treacherous footing, and of course silence, as the Germans were just across the river. This all took place in what became known as the Dusseldorf, or the Rhine River Pocket. This pocket yielded 317,000 German prisoners and broke the back of the German army. We were scheduled for Japan, but as you know, 3 months later, that war was also over.
Okay.
This is my showcase of memorabilia from the war in Germany. These two guns are models. I had a P-38, real one, in Germany, and a Luger, and I sold them over there. I thought I was going to be a millionaire. I sold one for $65, and I don't remember the other one. But this is a German officer's belt buckle. This is a light switch off of Hitler's personal air raid shelter in Berchtesgaden in the mountains, where he used to sit in that big living room and dream, looking out over the mountains and see what he could cook up next. And that switch is off of the staircase that led down into the rock, which was his personal air raid shelter. And this pencil is, I'm assuming it was Hermann Göring's pencil, because I found it in the remains of what Göring's house had been. And the pencil says, property of the Luftwaffe. So I feel like it has to be Göring's pencil. This is a Hitler Youth knife, and it's authentic, and I've got the paperwork for it from an officer in Germany. You had to have papers filled out in order to bring home war relics. And this is a replica, and so is this. And the reason I put replicas in there is because I had a knife like this, and I had a knife like this, and they were stolen in France on my way home. Somebody stole them out of my duffel bag. And the rest of these are just small pieces of memorabilia, insignias for uniforms, city buttons, medals for workers, and so forth. A few additional facts from memory that were left out of the previous talk. General Patton died as a result of an accident he was on his way to a hospital to award some medals, and I was on the way to the same hospital to see a friend of mine, and I came across Patton's accident, and I didn't realize, and they started routing traffic all around the intersection, and I didn't know until I got to the hospital what it was and who it was. My memory is that he died a short time after, and I believe he had a broken neck. Another memory, all the camps where troops came into Europe once they were established on the beachhead were named for cigarettes. And then the outgoing camps, or repo depots, were also named for cigarettes. Herbert Tarrington, Camels, Chesterfields, Lucky Strike. And Lucky Strike was the one that my outfit went into first and had to start building. Another thought was that when we finished basic training, we had to go 2 weeks in the field and drive vehicles up into the mountains, the Wichita Mountains, which is kind of between Texas and Oklahoma. And we had to go up this mountain. It wasn't a road, you couldn't call it a road, but that's the trail we took to the top of the mountain. And we made it up there okay and bedded down, and in the morning I got up and washed my face in my helmet full of water, as was typical of the soldier of that day, and looked out over the mountain. We were right on the very crest, and I saw this streak of dust coming up the valley. And I went on about my business, got my breakfast, and then I saw these people and mules coming up the trail near the top of the mountain. And I went over to see what was going on and discovered that the lead mule was led by my friend that I went into the service with, which is very unique. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I just got up." He said, "Man, I've been marching all night long with these mules." And what they were French 75 cannons mounted on mules and used for small, short-range battles that they might get into. And they were up there for their part of the program of practicing for war, actually. Another thought that came to me after the other writings were that I was quite seasick. And the reason I was seasick, I found out later, was that I was in the third row of bunks back from the very point of the bow of the ship. And that was the part that rose up the highest and came down the fastest. And if you don't think that'll make you seasick, forget it. Another thought was that I was on the radio, my shift on the radio, at 2 a.m. in the morning on April the 12th, 1945, and got the word on the radio that Roosevelt had died. And this probably had no immediate effect on the war, but he was a loved man, and most of the servicemen liked him, I believe. During the years that followed the war, I ran a gas station, a Shell station in Hamilton, New York. 7 gallons of gas for $1. As to my hitch during the Korean War, I was in the Army Security Agency, a very high-tech, high-security organization, a very hush-hush organization, and later absorbed into the CIA. My entire hitch was in the D.C. area. I attended George Washington University during that time and majored in German and business. I also married my present wife of 62 years, Wilma, in that same time frame on December 12, 1950.
Hey.
I'd like to share some pictures with you that my dad kept in a scrapbook while I was in service. And the first one I'd like to mention is my mother giving me advice the day before I left for my physical. And also on the same page, my dad is also giving me advice about being a man, I suppose.
Okay.
Which reminds me about a story about my dad. He went out west to work in the crops with a friend of his in an old Model T Ford, and he got a wire while he was out there, telegram, that he was coming up for draft. So they had to come home rather rapidly, and he was told to report to the train station in Utica, New York, and the group was sworn in and loaded onto the train and headed for New York, probably Fort Dix. And the train got as far as Albany, New York, and the engineer got a message that the armistice had been signed. If you haven't already guessed, this was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th year, Armistice Day in Europe. And everybody was tickled pink. And the train was turned around, sent back to Utica, and they were all given a check for $1. And I still have my dad's dollar check, and I tell my friends when I'm talking about it, this is why the federal government never can balance their books. This is a picture of a 155 millimeter cannon. This was nicknamed the Long Tom because we also had howitzers, which were shorter range, shorter barrels, but they were still a lot of gun. While going through Maastricht, Holland, on their way into Germany, one of the drivers kind of jerked his track around, and the gun barrel swung and hit the corner of a building and knocked a few bricks off. But the Dutch didn't mind that because they had been through a lot worse than that when the Germans were there. This is a card that I found, and I cannot remember where. I think possibly that I got it from the chateau that I was quartered in when I had pneumonia. This is a photograph or an artistic piece of exactly what my position was in World War II. And the guns in the background firing were regular 155s, and the radio, I know that it's a nomenclature of a 608, and it has one transmitter and 3 receivers, which can be unplugged and another receiver put in. And my dad wrote underneath that Ron says this is exactly what he was doing in World War II. This little patch I found in a house in Germany, and it's a communications patch or radio patch for German uniform, which was the job I had in the American Army, and I just thought it was rather unique. These are pictures of a USO group that came to our area in Germany following the war, but the troops still needed moral support. And Jack Benny brought that support to him. He was wonderful. He had with him Larry Adler, who played the harmonica, Martha Tilton, who was a singer, and Ingrid Bergman. And it was really quite a show in a huge crowd. This page is of Reims, France, and the Reims Cathedral on the bottom, which was a beautiful structure. And at the top, we have some of the German weaponry, the V1 and the V2, in a one-man, two-torpedo submarine, which I didn't know the Germans used them very much, probably around the harbors. They might have. That may be what happened to our supply ship. I have no way of knowing. This page has a lake that was visible from Hitler's house. Hitler's house was at the top of the mountain, and in the same area there were other houses of other German high command officers. For instance, Goering, and it was at Goering's house that I found one of his automatic pencils, which stated on the pencil, property of the Luftwaffe. So I feel sure this was Goering's pencil. And I can't remember some of the other names of some of the other officers, but there were several homes on the mountain. And later on, the Bavarian government and the Americans decided that they didn't want any semblance of memory in that area. So they decided to absolutely bulldoze the whole area. And if you haven't ever been there, you wouldn't even know what was there. But I went back in '83 and found the spot where Hitler's house was, because I recognized the driveway and the stone wall around the driveway. They left that intact. Okay, this page is of King Ludwig's palace, one of 4 that he had. And we took over the palace, and the whole battalion was quartered within the walls of the palace, and the troops all liked that because there was only one guard post, and that meant you didn't get guard duty very often. This is a drawing that I did in my spare time. I didn't realize I had any spare time, but I must have. And this is the weapon, the handgun that the German army adopted following the Luger. And the Luger went back prior to World War I. So this, again, I was done in my spare time, and I had one of these P-38s. It had never been out of cosmoline, which is a preservative, and I ran into a medical officer who had never been up to the front, and he offered me $65 for it. And being an 18-year-old kid, that was a fortune, and I sold it to him. So this is my replica of the weaponry in Germany, the handgun. This page is of an automobile which we commandeered, and the major which I was assigned to travel over Austria and pick up war crimes prisoners. This was his automobile, and I drove it, and we went all over Austria looking for war crimes prisoners in the various jails, Gefangenschafts, throughout Austria. And we had a 2.5 ton trucks with us, with MPs in them, to guard any prisoners that were picked up. We didn't find many that were on the list, but that's typical of what went on after the war. Everybody covered for everybody. That's it. These two on the top of the page are renderings of an emblem that the French was supposed to have given to the American Army for their participation and their help in breaking up the Colmar pocket. The French First Army was surrounded by Germans and needed help, and they sent us down there with our artillery to break up the pocket. And we never got the patch, but we did get a certificate of award from the French government at a much later date. In fact, last year, 2012, I received it. And that's the bottom page is what the nomenclature military-wise is a 193 radio, very powerful. It was this radio that I was on duty on April 12th and got the word that Roosevelt had died. And the other page also are my renderings of two other radios. At one time, my radio vehicle, for me to operate, I had 4 radios in the vehicle. It was a little busy at times. That's it. Miscellaneous pictures, some of the buddies and so forth that I was in charge of from our billet in Ludwigsburg, Germany, on our way home. I had to carry the records for 12 men, and when we got into Paris, I told the men that I had been there before. I knew a little bit about my way around the city, and if any of them wanted to stay with me, they were welcome. Otherwise, you be at the train station at midnight, or you will be AWOL. And this is the ship that we came home on. This was the Dominican Victory. I went over on a sea ship and came home on a Victory ship. The sea ship was the Sea Owl, OWL, and it was about the same size as the Dominican Victory. They were Kaiser ships built overnight, but they held together, and that's all I needed. It was great coming home to friends and family, and the atmosphere was a good one. Everybody was happy and glad for you that you made it okay. The only thing that I think of myself is so many troops, soldiers, sailors, whatever, had the opportunity to come home to gala events such as parades, bands playing, parties, and things such as that. And I came home as an individual soldier. I went overseas as an individual soldier. I was a replacement, a specific replacement to a specific unit. And I would have loved to have been able to come home to one of those types of gala events. After I finally got home from the wars, out of service as a civilian, I had to find employment. I was not very well trained for anything in particular, but I went to Syracuse, New York, and applied for employment with the Brown Lipe Chapin division of General Motors. And I was hired and placed in the engineering department, and was taught external expediting, which is going to various tool shops that are building tools for your plant and making sure they're on schedule and are working correctly, and that the work is right, and that they're working to the latest blueprints and things of that sort. It was a very interesting job, and I stayed with GM about 3 years, and I was traveling so much that when Wilma was pregnant with my second child, it sort of got down to the point of where it was either the job or her. I mean, it was a very difficult time for us because I was gone. The last summer I worked with them, I was gone all summer long because there were tool and die strikes in Detroit, and it held up our work, and the parts weren't going to be ready for show models at the Astor in New York, and boy, that'll make GM executives very mad. And so I resigned. We moved south because her mother, they thought she had TB, but it turned out to be cancer. And she lasted about a year after we came here, so at least Wilma got to be with her for a while. And then I went to work with Metropolitan Life, first as an agent and then as a consultant, then as an agency manager, then as a consultant manager, and then I was promoted into what they call field training and went all over the eastern United States, all the way to Texas, training managers to be what they should and shouldn't do as a manager. And I stayed with them 20 years, and I retired from Metropolitan. I can't remember the year, but I was 56 years old and retired on disability. Some of my old wartime haunts began to come back and haunt me. These framed certificates on the wall are for various hereditary organizations that I belong to. And I don't think I have them all up there because I belong to 16. Mm-hmm. The top one is the bench and bar, and that is heritage back to an ancestor who was a lawyer. And the next one is the Order of First Families of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. And of course that's kind of self-explanatory. It's families of the earliest plantations in Rhode Island. This one is a General Society of Colonial Wars. And of course I had ancestors in all of the colonial wars up to the Revolution. And this is a certificate for belonging to the Blue and Gray, which is an organization of officers of both sides. This one is the William Bradford certificate belonging to the Bradford family of the Mayflower. And the one below it is the descendants of William Bradford, and then the order of descendants of colonial governors. I had an ancestor who was a governor who was also William Bradford of the Mayflower. He was governor of the Plymouth colony for some 35 years. This one is the order of descendants of colonial physicians and chirurgeons. That's the way they pronounced surgeons in those days. And I go back to Hannah Bradford Ripley, who Hannah Bradford was the granddaughter of Governor William Bradford of the Pilgrim Colony. And she took care of her father, who was wounded in the wars, King Philip Wars, who were renegade Indians, and he got shot up pretty bad down in Rhode Island, and his troops brought him back to Plymouth, and his daughter Hannah brought him back to health. And they sent her back to England to study medicine. She was so adept at it. And she came back to the colonies and became the first woman doctor in America. This is the National Gavel Society, which you have to have been an international president of one of the listed hereditary organizations, of which I was the Bradford Compact. I was president from 87 to 90. This one is the Continental Society of Indian Wars, and of course I go back to William Bradford's son, who was shot up in the Indian Wars down in Rhode Island. This is the Order of Americans of Armorial Ancestry. This certifies that Ronald Johnson Horton is a member by right of descent from Thomas Richards, who was knighted. National Society Sons of the American Revolution. This is the organization that I have been most active in for 35 years and have been in about every job they offer except the President General, but I have been Vice President General. And this is the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, which I belong through Captain Charles Jefferson Johnson, my great-grandfather, 148th New York Volunteer Infantry in the Civil War. This organization was founded by 3 officers who were bound and determined at Lincoln's deathbed to form an organization that was very tight security and investigate Lincoln's assassination. They felt that there was a plot, that it wasn't a one-man thing. And the organization has survived till today.
Ron, thank you for your wonderful history lesson today. At this time, do you have any additional comments that you would like to make?
Well, the other night I was lying in bed thinking back and reminiscing, and there are 2 or 3 things that were important to me that might be interesting to others. When I had pneumonia, and they billeted me in the French chateau, the battery commander assigned 2 people to care for me. One private from Boston, who became my best friend. He's still alive, we still see each other. And a Tech Sergeant Pedersen, who unfortunately just passed away in January of this year. And they took great care of me. I thank God for them. The second thing that I thought of was the first night we set up our guns and fired. I was alone in my radio truck, It was dark, I was scared, and I said, I gotta do something in case somebody tries to sneak up on me, because I don't know where I am. So I went outside and took a bunch of sticks and stuck them in the ground, tied a string to them, and dumped out a bunch of sea ration cans and tied them to the string and put a pebble in each can so that if anybody tripped the wire, I would hear that pebble rattle in the can, and went back inside my radio truck and bedded down for the night. And the first thing I knew, I was awakened by tinkle, 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 and it scared me to death. And I reached over and grabbed my carbine, peeked out the flap, and lo and behold, the wind had come up and was rattling my little signals. So I went outside, tore them all down, went back, went to bed, took my chances. The third thing that I thought of was how I met my wife, Wilma, of 62 years. I was stationed in Fort Bragg following the war and used to go into Fayetteville to the USO and play games and so forth. And I heard someone playing the piano, and I believe they were playing Claire de Lune. And I seeked out the source of this music, and there was Wilma sitting at the piano. So I went up and stood there a minute and listened, and I asked her finally if she played boogie woogie, which was very popular then. And she said no, laughed. And I said, well, move over then, in my usual Yankee brashness. And she got up and let me sit down, and I played my 2 or 3 little riffs of boogie woogie. And I eventually walked her home that evening, and that was the beginning, but it took 4 years before we were married because we were so far apart. I was in New York, she was in North Carolina.